The language that is translated is called source language.
अपनी standard deviation वगैरह use करते हो आप?
Into which it is translated is called the target language.
But why do we need translation?
Translation to reach out to a larger audience.
We need translation to understand philosophy, politics, and history, which may not be available in the language we speak.
Many people are able to enjoy the creative, highly imaginative, and fertile minds of authors writing in foreign languages through translations. Without translation, people would not have access to the vast majority of literary works that are available in archives and libraries around the world.
You won't have the opportunity to enjoy the ways ancient authors view life and express their major emotions. You won't be able to understand how people back then thought compared to people who live in modern era.
Translation allows you to travel back in time and relive such moments.
But what is the purpose of translation?
The purpose of translation is to convey the message, taking into account the difference in cultural and regional ethos between source and target languages.
तो तुमने मिर्जा गालिब को तो सुना ही होगा।
तो सुनाओ जरा।
पत्ता पत्ता बूटा बूटा हाल हमारा जाने न जाने गुल ही न जाने बाग तो सारा जाने आशिक साथ तो सादा कोई और न होगा दुनिया जी के जिया को इश्क में उसके अपने वारा जाने।
अब इसे इंग्लिश में सुनाओ।
Every plant and every petal my condition knows. Only the flower knows not, the entire garden knows. Nobody in this world can be as simple as a lover. When in love, his heart's enemy, his God, does he consider.
Now, that was a very great translation. The essence of poetry has been captured very effectively. यही तो challenge है translation का।
Target language में है या source language?
मतलब हिंदी के लेखक ने लिखी है या इंग्लिश के ऑथर ने?
आओ चले तुम और मैं जब शाम छाई हो आकाश तले जब ईथर से बेहोश मरीज पड़ा हो टेबल पे आओ गुजरे कुछ आधी सुनसान गलियों से सस्ते रैन बसेरों में सीपी की ढाल से सजे आंधी भरे रेस्टोरेंट में बिताई हुई रातों की बुदबुदाती आरामगाहों से ये बताओ कि ये पोएम हिंदी कवि की है या इंग्लिश पोएट की?
ये तो किसी हिंदी का वीडियो लग रही है।
The translator has done a brilliant job with both target and the source language. The writer of this poem is T.S. Eliot. नाम है The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock. बाद में पढ़ें।
So friends, today's webinar will address similar issue related to translation.
So, without further ado,
चलो शुरू करें अमर
you and me.
Thank you so much, students, for this. Now I formally welcome everybody who has joined me and the department for this webinar. In the times that we live in, where the data of patients in terms of COVID is peaking every day due to pandemic, Kuvar Narayan's words remind me of reality. I would like to share this event with some words from Kuvar Narayan, whose life and literary works we are celebrating. He says, मुझे लगा, अचानक मुझे लगा, खतरों से सावधान कराते की संकेत चिन्ह में बदल गई थी डॉक्टर की सूरत और मैं आंकड़ों का कांटा चीरता चला जा रहा था कि हम आंकड़े नहीं आदमी हैं. Good morning, good afternoon again, and welcome to the webinar of English Department on Translation. Before we start, I would like to invite Inspector Dr. Shiv Kumar Sehdev to address this event with his encouraging words, and then we'll move further. Sir, over to you.
Mr. John Water, he is a educationist, researcher and translator. all the esteemed participants, dear colleagues and dear students. I am very happy that the Department of English has organized this webinar on translation studies. And today we have with us Mr. John Water from USA. So I welcome you, sir. And I'm sure that my students and faculty members will definitely enjoy your talk. So my best wishes. Have a nice time. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir, for this encouraging and warm welcome to our speaker and our students. Now, I'm just going to brief you in 2-3 lines about something about the translation studies and the life that we are celebrating. This talk, Betwixt Craft and Research, Translation, the Twain Shall Meet, will attempt to address many challenges and questions that are confronted by readers as well as writers who undertake this voyage. The speaker today will address many ideas related to this craft. Also, not to forget that we are here to celebrate the works of Kunwar Narayan, and he has been recipient of many awards, and to name few, some are Sahitya Akademi Award, Kabir Samman, the highest All India Poetry Award, and many more. Now, I will do the introduction of the speaker, but just before that, I would also like to invite Dr. Sonali to introduce also this event. Sonali, Dr. Sonali, who's a faculty member. She has also recently published her book on Premchand named Prem Ashram. So over to you, Dr. Sonali.
Thank you so much, Preeti. A very good afternoon to all of you, my friends, colleagues, and students from Shivaji and even outside our department who have joined us here at this time for this wonderful talk, which is titled Betwixt Craft and Research, Translation, the Twain Shall Meet. But before I say anything else, I would just like to read a few lines from the famous Dogri poet Padma Sachdev's poem titled Mother Tongue. I approached a stem swinging on a reed and asked him to give me a quill. Are you some sort of an accountant with some shah where you need a new pen every other day, he asked. No, I don't work for a shah, I said, but for a shahani, very kind. That shahani is my mother tongue Dogri. Give me a quill, quickly. The reed cut off his hand, gave it to me, said, take it. I too am her servant. And this is a translation from Dogri by an anonymous translator. But again, the point that I wish to emphasize is that this poem has come to us via the beautiful craft of translation. And the point it makes is also very evocative for our purpose today. Because the mother tongue is, of course, the Shahani, who is the queen, the wife of a Shah. Besides, in this particular poem, she assumes an independent authority of her own. And of course, she's loved by many servants who are not just the poets, but even the plants, the reeds of her land, who just cannot refuse to become her pen and the quilt. But moving on from here, it seems imperative to add that the most humble of her new servants would be the translator, the unnamed pen who has made this beautiful dialogue accessible to us, to this non-Dogri speaking world, the Hindi, Indian, or even the international reader. So this is the craft, my friends, which opens a window into various worlds, hitherto unknown, hitherto unraveled, hitherto untraveled. How does a translator tread on these paths before he's able to take the reader along with him? What are the hurdles? What are the challenges or the rewards that this cross-cultural journey that he undertakes? Let's find out. And for that, I would like to welcome today's honored speaker, John Water, who's a translator, researcher, and a co-translator of Kunwar Narayan's play of Doors. So I move over to Dr. Preeti Bisodia, who is our head of department, who would formally introduce our honored guest to you. Thank you so much.
Just before I introduce Mr. John Water, I would take this opportunity today to introduce Mr. Apurva Narayan, also. And I'm sorry, sir, that I actually missed that you had just joined. So allow me to introduce you. It's our pleasure that you are here with us. We formally wanted you to invite, but I think we can still do it in upcoming time. I think, can the co-host please unmute Dr. Apurva? We can't hear you, sir. Yes, sir.
Just wanted to thank you so much for this. I also wanted to join in today, but my timings were a little kind of hazy. So it's I've somehow managed to be here. So I will love to listen in. And thank you so much for hosting this.
We are happy that you have joined in. Just for a very brief bio, I'm welcoming Mr. Apurva Narayan, who has been a consultant, researcher, and editor of many books. He has written many books in English. His work is a testament not only to our own literary sensibilities, but also to his patient resolve to bring our readers of English to the outstanding work of Kuvar Narayan's literary writings. Thank you, sir, for joining us. I hope you enjoyed this talk, and our students, and feel free to join us in this interactive discussion.
Sure. Yes.
And just a second. Okay, so welcoming Mr. John Water here. I would like again this opportunity to introduce him. Mr. John Water, the co-translator of the Play of the Dolls book, written by Kuvar Narayan and research fellow at National University of Singapore. John is a man of varied interests. He holds a master's degree in fine arts in literary translation from University of Iowa. John has also worked as a Nehru Fulbright's Nehru student researcher in India for 2 years. He has researched on Dalit politics and literature and India's multilingual publishing industry. He has interned as an editorial assistant in the English publishing house Navanya and the Hindi publishing house in India, Vani Prakashan. He has translated a collection of short stories named Near About Shapes from Hindi into English by author Kuvar Narayan from Penguin Random House, India. We are very happy to have you here with us. John, over to you. The platform is yours.
Can everyone hear me and see me? Am I showing up on the screen?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Thank you so much, Preeti, for this invitation. And I would like to also extend my thanks to Shivaji College and the Department of English, and to all of your colleagues who have given me such a warm welcome. I also loved the translation video that all of your students prepared, so I can tell that we're dealing with high caliber students. And I'm very glad that Apurva is here and can join our conversation. I'm envisioning that the talk maybe will be around 40 minutes, 45 minutes, and that afterward we can maybe open it up to have a conversation. So as Preeti and I were discussing the talk, she had actually sent me a syllabus, that all of the students, the BA honors students, are focusing on. And I'd like to say that the syllabus really wowed me. It made me really want to take the course over there. You begin with the Mahabharata and Kalidasa. You have sections on American literature, also focusing on popular literature like detective fiction. And I understand that there's also a translation course where you look at people like Premchand and Mukti Bodh and others. So I think that this provides a really strong foundation to have a conversation about translation, because all of the students have been exposed to really wonderful literature at different periods in time, in different cultures, and also at different registers. I'd like to say at the outset that the way that I've framed this talk has mostly been directed at the students, because I imagine that many of them, being English majors, may be very interested in starting translation or in doing creative writing themselves. But I understand that this is also being broadcast over YouTube and possibly Facebook, and we have many other people from across Delhi University who are joining us. So my hope is that in narrating a little bit about what my translation journey has been like and translating these stories, there might be points of interest to you as well that we can talk about. So as Preeti mentioned, I'll mostly be focusing on talking about the translation of Kunwar Narayanji's The Play of Dolls. I think in my bio, there was an earlier title which we had thrown around for the book, which was Near and Around Shapes, Near About Shapes. So even coming up with the title for a short story collection, can be an act of translation in and of itself. I won't have the time to go into what translating all of the stories was like. Kunwarji is, a master technician and poet, and all of the stories to different ways deploy different literary techniques, approach different subjects. And so it wasn't the case that we had some sort of master blanket translation strategy that covered all of them. But in talking a little bit about what my own learning curve was like as a Master in Fine Arts student at the University of Iowa, I'm also going to bring in what translating the short story Fear was like and the different challenges that it posed as a sort of window into some of the different issues that Apurva and I faced in the rest of the collection. So we'll talk about how craft, the actual writing act, and then research intersect. And I do hope that afterward we can have maybe a literary conversation on the contents of the book. I understand some of you may have had a chance to read it, or on any other aspect of the translation journey I'm getting ready to start. So I had been asked to share what my experiences as a translator have been like, and I thought it would be good to kind of begin with some of the basic impulses in case others might be interested. There is a really wonderful book, and I'll be pulling out some other books, which I hope some of you will be able to pick up, which is called This Little Art by Kate Briggs. It's kind of difficult to classify this book as a genre. It's a very long, reflective essay, very lyrical in scope, where the author reflects on what translation means to her. And I think that she puts the initial impulse for translation very well, where she quotes Barthes as saying that to want to write to some degree is the desire to want to rewrite. And to this, she also adds that translation or writing is also wanting to add oneself actively to that which is beautiful and that which I lack. And I really liked this definition of the impetus for translation, because it brings together not just translation, but also underlying rationales for writing as well as research. I'm sure many of you are aware that you read something in your childhood or at any point that really strikes you, you find it beautiful, and it's from reading that you begin to think, I would like to try to write something like this. The author gives one particular example of a way in which I believe it was Joan Didion characterizes the dawn, but in literary language. And the line is, the coming morning reaches its long arm into the night. And something about that image captured a moment of truth for the author, a sort of wow moment that she began to want to figure out, how can I write something similar? So even if it's not in a different language, even if it's, from our own language, there is this kind of germ or seed or impetus that makes us also latch on to something that is beautiful and also want to speak after it, speak on it, speak through it. Second, Ralph Waldo Emerson is also referenced in your syllabus as one of the authors that you're looking at. And Ralph Waldo Emerson is, one of my absolute favorite thinkers. And one of the reasons why I especially value him is because I think that he asks a very important question for research or for any type of thinking, which is how can we have an original relationship with the universe, which is what he wrote, I believe, at the beginning of his long essay, Nature. But one of the interesting things about, even some of the research we read and even something that we view as being so fundamental to American thought. Emerson was one of the fathers of the American Renaissance. Is that a lot of Emerson's thoughts were actually inspired by Indian texts. And so it was around this time that the Bhagavad Gita and the Upanishads had actually been translated and had been made available in London and in Paris. And so there's an argument that actually he eagerly acquired these books. And American politics and the juncture in history was such that they were allowed to express themselves in new ways through his thought, which now we kind of think of as being quintessentially American. And so one of the things I've learned in terms of research and in terms of craft as I've gotten deeper into this is the intertextuality. And how actually it's not quite so simple that you have, say English over here, Hindi over there. So as I talk, that's an idea that I kind of want to complicate. So to talk a little bit about, getting started, a lot of you are students taking different classes. When I was an undergraduate, I was taking creative writing classes, but also language classes in Hindi and Urdu, doing South Asian area studies to learn more about culture. And I had a lot of really great teachers who encouraged my interests. So it was kind of in that melting pot that I began to think that translation is something that I wanted to do. And as Preeti mentioned, I had the chance to go to India on a Fulbright, doing some research on Hindi literature. Later on, I stuck around in India and assisted with the study abroad program. And a lot of this was to get better context and to actually explore the different Hindi writing that was out there and what attracted me. And it was during this time that I read Kunwarji's stories for the very first time. And almost immediately it was a perfect match. They seized me, mesmerized me. There was something magical about them that I wanted to understand. And then after that, I went to the University of Iowa, which has a translation workshop dedicated to translation, where I kind of learned a bit about how to refine my craft, how to become a better translator. And it was a really wonderful experience. And I'll be talking a little bit about what that workshop was like, because some of the methods that are used are very easy to pick up and emulate. So if anyone is interested in forming groups or translation over there in New Delhi and throughout the rest of India, it's something that's quite easy to do. So when I first started at the University of Iowa, one question which kind of perplexed me, but I think is actually quite common, is the question, well, what do I translate? How do I choose? What is a good thing to bring across into a different language? And this was a question that actually kind of perplexed me somewhat, because I had, one of those experiences where as soon as I read, these stories, I knew I had to translate them, but there's also questions of canon. For a lot of people, they don't even get to choose the works that they translate. Sometimes that's chosen by a publisher, and they end up doing it commercially. And I think the consensus is that a lot of what ends up being translated, there's not necessarily a rhyme or reason for it. A lot of people just naturally are attracted. Something speaks to them, and they use their own skills as a writer to help bring that out. For those who aren't necessarily interested in translation, but are maybe more on the creative writing side, one of the editors at Navayana at one point had said that translation actually works as a great guru in the sense that it teaches you a lot of things about creative writing, and learning to identify and to master some of the different techniques that the original author employs. You yourself have to become a writer. And so there's a lot of discipline that goes into that, and also a lot of thought about the types of language that we use. And I don't think I'd ever really thought about language as such until I started translating. And finally, there's a sort of performative dimension to translation. There are many different metaphors of what translation is, but to some degree, we're also performing it in our own language. And so that requires a sort of double think, about what will work, what will communicate in our own cultural and aesthetic contexts. So to talk a little bit about this workshop model, it'll kind of help to frame what my own personal initial journey was like. So the translation workshop is fundamentally premised around this thing called the workshop itself, which is really just a group of translators who get together and share the pieces that they're working on. You know, it could be poetry or it could be prose, and then having the benefit of other colleagues who are also close readers and also interested in the craft to read it very critically and to give their pointed feedback, you know, saying, this works, that doesn't work. One of the great things is that the translators there were operating from many different languages. We had people writing from Japanese, from Turkish, from Spanish. And so at the same time that it employed a different type of close reading in the sense of what is the effect of a sentence, how long is a sentence, what is the tone, is the register coming out, how much does that register reflect voice. To another extent, it was also a process of actually matching languages. So the cadences of, say, Hindi or Bengali or Spanish don't necessarily match the cadences of English. Sometimes there is an issue of temporality, where what could take you 3 seconds to say in English or in another language could take much longer on the other side of the coin. And so you're not only thinking about meaning, how do I get the meaning across, but you're also thinking about the tangibility of the language and the rhythm itself. And so that becomes a little bit more complicated. And luckily, working through this with other people to give you feedback, you kind of begin to get a sense for it. To be fair, and I think this is somewhat inevitable in this process, one of the downsides of doing a sort of workshop model are that it's been criticized as being a type of translation by consensus. And so what can happen is that inevitably, if you're translating into a new environment, there is a pre-established mode of aesthetics that is operating, and people are coming at the text with their own values and mindsets. So if, say if 7 people in the group, tell you that you need to speed up a story, or tell you that we need more drama, you as a translator, you as a person are pressured to change the text. And in different ways, this has been referred to in translation theory as an act of violence, and the act of violence can go both ways. And so at the same time that it offers this wonderful kind of incubation zone to be able to learn, on the other hand, there's also a very sort of fraught ethical, political, aesthetic dimension where they can't see into your language to the same degree. There's something that you recognize and you value that draws you to the text. And so there's also an element of pushback in education as everyone kind of gets a sense of what the text is trying to do. And that's inevitable when you have this kind of cross-cultural collision. So the big 3 key lessons of the workshop, which I thought were great, were 1, to be very conscious of what it is that you're translating. So it's not possible, to just translate. That oftentimes becomes an excuse. Second is experimentation. We like to think that there's a perfect translation out there, but ultimately what there are different iterations of the text and of what you can bring out. And so because of the limitations of language or culture, it is often the case that maybe you can bring out some core components of the translation, but others maybe get lost. The benefit is that there's an afterlife of the text, and there are multiple translators, who end up filling those gaps. I just read 2 works by Dostoevsky, who's one of my favorite authors. And I noticed that, both for The Devils and for The Double, they had different translators. And so their approaches to the book were very different. And so it's actually possible to kind of do a comparison and as a more critical mode of reviewing, look at how it is that the translator approached a specific text, which also gets at what is not there. And finally, as I've already mentioned, is just how important it is to read very closely. which I think all of the students here are learning to do as English majors. So to make it a little bit more specific, since so far I've been speaking in kind of broad generalities, I wanted to talk about the translation of the short story Fear, or Ashanka in the Hindi. This is one of the very first stories from the collection that I translated. And what was really fascinating to me about it is that in a very bizarre way, it echoed Kafka, which is an author I was familiar with. The story, for those who haven't had a chance to read, is essentially about a writer who is alone in his room, and he's looking down at a piece of paper doing his writing. And then something, a type of entity that's not quite clear, but it is compared to an insect, enters the room and crawls over his paper. So there's, kind of immediate cross-references possibly to the Metamorphosis. And yet the story itself is very different than the Metamorphosis. And it kind of becomes about, what is this thing that has come into the room? What is the nature of this fear? So I'm gonna read a passage from the English translation, just 1 or 2 paragraphs, not too long. And then I'll read some of the Hindi, and you'll maybe get a sense of, kind of what Apurva and I did for the translation. And then I'll begin to go a little bit more into some of the mechanics. So to start with the English version. Fear. Like some scary and dirty insect, it crept into the room and, settling over my papers, sat down, maybe with the intent to nibble at them and eat them up. I had a mind to pick it up and throw it outside, but it was unimaginably grotesque. I thought I'd ask my helper to toss it out, and if one helper wouldn't do, then several. Maybe it sensed my plan. But surprisingly, it seemed completely unafraid and undeterred by this too. I was looking at that weak little thing, unable to fathom the source of its audacity. Despite the expression of anger on my face, there had been no change in its arrogant composure. On the contrary, its crude daring seemed to take on even greater proportions. It was looking at me as if I was powerless to do it any harm, whereas if it wanted, it could destroy me all in a moment with a mere flick of its fingers. That a beast like it should hold in its hand the power to destroy a human being like me. The very thought filled my heart with aversion, and my spirit sank. So now I'll read a little bit from the Hindi. आशंका. किसी गंदे और डरावने कीड़े की तरह वो कमरे में घुस आया और मेरे कागजों पर जमकर बैठ गया, शायद उन्हें कुटर कुटर कर खाने की नीयत से। उसे उठाकर बाहर फेंक देने को जी चाहा, लेकिन वो बेहद घिनौना था। सोचा नौकर से कहकर उसे बाहर फेंकवा दूं, और अगर एक नौकर काफी न हो तो कई नौकरों से। वो शायद मेरा इरादा भंग किया, लेकिन आश्चर्य कि वो इस पर भी बिल्कुल नहीं डरा। मैं उस कमजोर सी चीज को देख रहा था। समझ में नहीं आ रहा था कि उसके इस दुस्साहस का स्रोत क्या है। मेरी नाराज मुखमुद्रा से भी उसके उदंड इत्मीनान में कोई फर्क नहीं आ रहा था, बल्कि एक बदतमीज साहस और भी बढ़ता सा दिखाई दिया। वो मुझे इस तरह देख रहा था जैसे मैं उसका कुछ नहीं बिगाड़ सकता, मगर वो चाहे तो सिर्फ अपनी उंगलियों के इशारे से मुझे पल भर में नष्ट कर दे। उस जैसे जानवर के हाथ में मुझ जैसे इंसान को नष्ट कर देने की ताकत हो, ये सोचकर ही मन कटुता और निराशा से भर उठा। So after listening to the Hindi, there are some different interesting things going on. There's a sort of compelling vagueness to some of the language which is used. We have kisi, we have multiple uses of things like ki tarha or jase. Even the term waha, or wo, doesn't necessarily have a clear referent. It could be he, she, or it. Shayad is used multiple times. We have kamzorsi, with the suffix si, sa, also lending a type of indeterminacy. Cheese is one word that is used kind of ambiguously. And then we also have these kind of enigmatic categories of janvar and insan. In terms of the pacing of the story, this is maybe different than some where it doesn't, there is some action when the bug or insect-like thing comes into the room. But there's a very powerful meditative dimension. And you can tell that we're in a type of stream of consciousness. The pacing is not particularly fast. And there is the use of a lot of progressive verbs, dekh raha tha, samajh mein nahi aa raha tha, and a sort of mirroring that takes place between what is observed on the behalf of the writer, of the narrator, and then what the thing is that he's observing does, and then how that then recycles back into the author's, the narrator's perception. So I chose this story just because the first time that I, made an attempt at it, I actually made a lot of mistakes, and I think that the mistakes are best, for us to learn from. At least for what I've been taught for English writing, we're often told that we need to use very concrete, definite language. Things need to be very clear. Especially with prose, which is often seen in the sort of dramatic tradition. It's very good to get to the action. Things being fast-paced helps to propel the reader into the story and helps to seize their interest. And so I wouldn't say that the first time that I translated, I did all of these things, but I think definitely what happened is that there was a bit of unevenness where some of the aesthetics of what I understood to be good writing kind of filtered into the types of words that I chose. At the same time, for the types of indeterminacy that are at play, I would later learn that this was actually quite central, to what the story was trying to communicate. And at different times, I had opted for trying to make some things a little bit more clear than they should have been. So predictably, even though a lot of my colleagues cannot read the Hindi, even if you read the English, oftentimes you get a sense that maybe something is not quite communicating in the way that it should. Maybe something is not operating in the right way, and so it gives you an opening, an opportunity to ask about, should the register be as high as this? Does it actually need a flatter tone? A lot of my colleagues were initially very confused about the nature of what this thing was that had entered the room. And part of that is because I myself at the point of translating did not fully understand it. And so unless as a translator, you have a very conscious, deliberate sense of what you're doing, sometimes what you're communicating can come out muddled. And so some of their feedback was understandably based on how they understand stories to operate. So they wanted the story to move faster than it was. They were a little bit confused, why it was called fear, and yet, actually at the very outset of the story, there's a type of, curiosity and annoyance, which later evolves into fear, but it's not quite scary. And so my director at the time, kind of spotted, maybe something is not quite right. And so because of the connections and allusions to Kafka, he pulled out an excerpt from Kafka's story, The Vulture, and he read the story out loud, and he began to ask, is the tone and the register as flat as this? Because actually it can be a stylistic effect to have language, be one way. and then to have the content of what is happening in another. And it's actually that friction that creates, a type of stylistic integrity. So in order to kind of make a lot of what I'm saying, maybe a little bit more theoretical, there's a translator, Annie Montot, who has an essay from India in Translation Through Hindi Literature, A Plurality of Voices, who I think captures some of what was happening very well, where she says that the use of supposedly Western stylistic techniques or topics amounts to a subtle subversion of them in order to voice a distinctly original message. And that translation, now in this restricted meaning of the term, has to deal with this stylistic subversion if it wishes to voice some of the original in a different language. So I was a bit shocked that, in translating Narayan and translating from Hindi, I suddenly maybe needed to start thinking about who all was Narayan reading, who was Narayan influenced by, how could I read what was easily accessible to me in English or through translation to master or to think about how he might have been using some of these effects. So this began for me the second stage, and this is where craft and research really began to collide, where it was clear that I was not communicating, the original intent or the mystery of the story effectively. And so also the workshop was not entirely able to help me solve this problem. They were able to say, okay, this is not quite working. We see a problem here, but they are more kind of like simple symptoms of something which I, as the translator, had to figure out and address. And I believe earlier it had been mentioned that challenge is not only involved in translation, but also the process of rewards. And translating Narayan really was like a process of discovery in the sense that it sent me in many different directions, reading things that, I never maybe would have had the necessity to read, but which also, as a sort of byproduct, kind of helped to make the world a bit bigger. And this happened through, a very collaborative process. As I mentioned, I spoke with peers. I began to look at the text in a different way. I began to closely read the kind of mapping out, how long is this line? How much time does this paragraph take? What are the types of words used? Do the words reappear multiple times? What do I think as an active interpretation the text means? And at the same time, looking for clues from other writers of South Asian languages. So I had referenced Annie Montot before, but also just recently, the other day, I had been reading over this book, which is really quite wonderful. It's called Translating Bharat, Reading India, which was brought out by Yatra Books. And there's a translator, Priya Chabria, who has an essay called Translating the Sacred, where I think that she gets at some of what I was wrestling with at the time, but didn't quite understand. So I'll read a short excerpt of how she describes it, which is she does quite well. For the poet that she was translating, which I believe was a Bhakti poet, she said that a type of coded elusiveness was key. And besides the literal meaning, simultaneous, parallel, and inset meanings needed to be extracted. And she later refers to the riddled generosity of interpretive possibilities. And so no one writer is the same, but there is, I think, a sort of South Asian tradition that often touches upon larger metaphysical, spiritual, philosophical levels. And while it's not the case that obviously all writers do this, I think Narayan is definitely working within a tradition where his work is doing a lot of things at once. And so in order to even, begin to bring all of that out into English, what is so important is just understanding what is happening. So as a way to kind of, better understand it, working from my different cultural context, we had a Kafka scholar in our comparative literature department. And believe it or not, we went to a cafe and sat down, and I did a very literal translation of each of the lines. And we kind of worked through it very slowly. And we obviously relate to the text in different ways, depending on where we're coming from. And she saw all sorts of, almost like physics, all sorts of things happening that reminded her of Kafka. And yet there was also something that was distinctly Narayan, which she didn't understand. And in that sense, we also hit a sort of impasse in that she couldn't tell me that answer either. Then another example of how I went about researching to translate. There's another story, Dubious Moves, and also The Play of Dolls, which uses a type of allegory. So just as a sort of exercise, I went back and I read different extracts from Hawthorne, his different fables, like Goodman Brown and The Scarlet Letter. And I hope you'll indulge me here, but I read this preface in The Scarlet Letter, and it was a very mind-blowing, semi-mystical experience where it seemed like actually Hawthorne, way back in America at the turn of the 18th century, was actually approaching writing and thinking about writing in a way that was, very similar to the romance with reality, as Narayan puts it, of his own work. And so I'm going to read a short excerpt of Hawthorne's preface, which for me shed some light on what I began to think Narayan was doing as well. Moonlight in a familiar room, falling so white upon the carpet and showing all its figures so distinctly, making every object so minutely visible, yet so unlike a morning or noontide visibility, is a medium the most suitable for a romance writer. All these details, so completely seen, are so spiritualized by the unusual light that they seem to lose their actual substance and become things of intellect. Thus, therefore, the floor of our familiar room has become a neutral territory, somewhere between the real world and a fairyland, where the actual and the imaginary may meet, and each imbue itself with the nature of the other. And in doing some of the research for these stories, Apoorva generously provided some different criticism from Hindi, where different Hindi writers talked about the very innovative and revolutionary effects at that time. And one of the comments that was made was the sense of the feeling of thought, which pervades a lot of his work. So I found this, this bizarre confluence very apt. At the same time, it's not sufficient, obviously, to just look and turn toward your own tradition for some of these techniques and effects, but a very deep curiosity and exploration in what is different, the unfamiliar, was also needed. And from the very beginning, Apoorva had been great in, first providing the stories, later providing background materials, essays, autobiographical journal jottings, works of criticism, which Narayan had done, essays he had written in English. And so I began to devour these to get a greater sense of the author's corpus. I believe it was Schleiermacher, who is another German translation theorist, who talks about how there's a genius of the language, which would be some of the things that Hindi can do that English can't. But there's also the genius of the author. And the further I moved into these stories, the more and more it became apparent that even though I was doing a lot of this outside reading, which gave me a lot of great context and operated as kind of like signs to put me in the right direction, what was really probably the most important was to understand what poetics meant for the author. And so Apoorva is my co-translator in this, and he's translated a lot of his father's poetry. He has one poetry collection, No Other World. Another collection is coming out. And so later, it was very productive and constructive to have a dialogue back and forth where we, interpreted what does the story mean? What are some of the inner recesses? If there is a generosity of interpretive possibilities, how is it that we can choose the word that is able to signal most of these. But at the time, this was when I was, still in workshop and doing my thesis. And this entire process and discovery, first learning to read like a translator, looking at the language, looking at what the language is trying to do, doing the background research, understanding what it might have been that Narayan was alluding to, the genre and mode that he was writing in as a type of romance. Also helped in some ways to both frame and understand, but also push back against some of the feedback that I was getting from others. And in some ways, I'm kind of happy to say, and I think this is very important for literature to do, is that these stories are actually very controversial in my workshop, in the sense that they did not immediately conform to a lot of the dictates of contemporary English writing. And I think subconsciously, there was an attempt to try to make it do what a lot of other stories in 21st century American English were doing. But translation educates at the same time. And so what was also quite wonderful to see is that, as I was improved in my ability to communicate what was happening in the text, so too did the appreciation for the stories amongst my peers grow. And so it became accepted. And I think this is a kind of microcosm of what happens with translation. There's a communication process involved in that you want it to work, you want people to enjoy it, at the same time that you also need to push boundaries. And the extent to which one does that, in some cases is called domestication, in some cases it's called foreignization, really is determined by your own relationship with what is important in the text and what you as a translator want to bring out. So this is mostly concludes my talk, and if people are interested, I can talk with Apurva about the co-translation process later, because as I said, there is a multidimensionality to the text with allegory, fable, philosophy, rhythm, allusions to mythology, Mughal history, Buddhist ontology. And I think it's fair to say that even though, we think of research over here, translation over here, producing this book really required a combination of both. And I have a friend who's a professor back in the United States who has written a full book on Hindi writing as a work of research, and she's also translated a collection of stories. And for her, she was saying that the difficulty was comparable. So with that, this ends just the formal talk period, where I wanted to kind of give you an account of what some of my translation journey has been like. But there's a lot in the book which I haven't had the time to touch on. And so for those of you who have read the stories, I really encourage you to ask whatever questions most inspire you, what you find to be most interesting. So Apurva is also here, so maybe he can join in, and we're happy to take any questions. So again, thank you so much to Shivaji for having us here.
Thank you so much, John. Over to Sonali. Sonali ma'am, can you take the platform and do a moderation of the talk so that we can proceed for the questions? Sonali.
All right. Thank you so much, John, for this lovely, enlightening, let's say, foray into this amazing world of translation. It's very often not rated properly, not understood properly. You need to understand what translation can or what translation would be able to mean in the coming future. And that was very, very enlightening. You began with your initial forays into this world, the problems of choices before a prospective translator, then how to deal with the various dilemmas of communicating meaning, not just communicating, but communicating effectively the meaning, the essence of the chosen work. Of course, the issues of language, which are different in different cultural contexts, and then that very interesting passage that you read out from Fear, your translation of Ashanka, and it had the resonances of Kafka, as you spelled out for us, and very problematic and very evocative of certain typical nuances that language resonates with. And of course, you talked about that how it's so difficult, it's so challenging, and it's so rewarding to even try to translate this kind of stream of consciousness, what do you call, effect into a different language. वो देख रहा था, वो नजर नहीं आ रहा था, वो सुन रहा था, वो खड़ा था. That is very, very challenging and very rewarding as well. And of course, when you talked about your own, let's say, progression into this world, and how you dealt with the various plurality of meanings and the various notions that language puts forward before one. Whenever one chooses to translate, that was absolutely amazing. Thank you so much for that. I would now like to invite our friends, especially our students who've been dealing with this paper, which I luckily teach to them, that is Modern Indian Literature in Translation. You've already gone through the syllabus, John, and we would like your comments also. If you've read some of Tagore's poetry or the challenging Mukti Bodh poetry, which just simply takes you off head when you try to explain that to students not really familiar with that kind of Hindi, even students coming from the North Indian part of the country. So over to our students, please frame your questions, talk, think, respond to whatever sir has said. Yes, please.
Do we have any question? I think some of the students have posted the question on the chat box. So I think I can start with that, and then we can have a progression of question. So there is one question from Aniket. He asks, you mentioned that there is no perfect translation. How does one deal with what's lost in translation? If I may use this word, sometimes I'm not sure if it must be frustrating for a translator to not find the right words to capture the essence of the message. How do you deal with this during the process of translation?
I think that's a very good question. And it's obviously one that I've struggled a lot with, and many translators struggle with. For the first question, I think it's a little bit easier in the sense that if there were a perfect translation, then the perfect translation would probably be the original text itself. But that's not possible because of the incommensurabilities of language. So because of that, it's frankly just impossible to make a perfect match from A to B. So that's not really what you're doing. Walter Benjamin has a very interesting paper on the essence, I suppose, that is being brought over, and I think he actually references in his own way the Jewish Kabbalah, shards of a pot that actually reference something inside that is being carried across. So if we think about it, in a sort of linguistic, semantic way, every word that we choose reflects light on something. And so then the challenge would be, if in the original it's reflecting light on a certain set of meanings, how can you reflect light on, a similar number within your own language? Oftentimes what happens is you can't. And so, that may create the problem of loss. But I just don't feel it. It is a feeling of frustration, but like I said, it also offers opportunities for other people to translate. If there were a perfect translation, then the process of uncovering the work would stop there. And if we're to think about loss, even when you're just reading a book, you want to write a paper on it. And why do you want to write a paper on it? Because you want to add yourself to it, and you want to uncover something, that is there. So even when the text is communicating, there's a dialogue taking place. And in Kumarji's own writings, he talks quite frequently about having conversations with other things that he reads. And I think the conversation dimension is really maybe more important than thinking about what may be missing.
Okay. So thanks for the answer. I think John has answered the question. And the second question is, during the process of translation, it's not only about word to word, but the backdrop of an entire culture over generations of common codes. How do you capture a culture through mere language?
So this is a complicated question in the sense that it requires a familiarity, with that culture, and I, have tried my best to familiarize myself with different aspects of Indian tradition. But I would imagine, even being a citizen of India, the diversity is so vast. There are so many traditions that ultimately we're always going to be a little bit foreign to something. And yet it's also that foreignness that makes us, curious enough to learn more. I would say that I came to these stories from the outside. And so I think that there are probably elements within them which would have immediately sparked off echoes in an Indian reader's mind with, particular mythological archetypes, possibly of the goddess, or Buddhism, ways of knowing, observer and observed, or even, Rupert Sinel has a really great essay where he talks about the Turkish tapestry, which is used as a metaphor for translation. Often when we read the English, we see one side of the tapestry, and yet what is behind it is actually the complexity of the original. And he speaks about, one form of knowing in Indian tradition, is a type of metaphysics, which is very difficult to write about in English because our aesthetics are different. And I think that, one challenge for Apoorva and I has been to try to honor this metaphysical dimension, which is a dimension of culture. Even when in English, English as a language makes it a little bit more difficult to do. So the first would be familiarity. The second would be, the effort to familiarize yourself and to figure out, maybe what elements the author is channeling, and then to the best of your ability, to render it in your own words or your own context.
Okay, just a second. Another question. Also, I would like to add something to it regarding this book, which I found very interesting. I was talking about this to my students, and it's related to the answer that you just gave to that question. On page number, I would say, from the story The Play of Dolls, there are words like culvert on page number 28 and the second last paragraph. CULVERT. Now, I think translation in that sense not only makes us, familiar about other literature, it also makes us revisit the same language. Like I also a Hindi speaker, my mother tongue is also Hindi, but I'm revisiting so many things after reading these books and the new words and similar words, which I again revisited. And my favorite story was The Official, because it reminds me of a Sarkari office in which an old man goes and his work is not done. So, the whole essence of Indian bureaucracy is captured so beautifully in that language. And certain words like, how do you decide between, like the old man in The Official says namaskar. Do we use namaste or do we use namaskar? I think it takes a lot of cultural knowledge of language and its implication and how people understand those things. But last thing I would like to say is regarding this question, obviously, I'll ask more questions on behalf of students, is the way the topic of the title of the book is. It is so interesting in the way that when you look at it, the play of dolls, students thought it's a play of dolls, but if you really know the nuances of cultural translated text, it's Good Day Gudiyon Ka Khel, which is basically about marriage. and we use it in such language. We say कि शादी कोई गुड्डे गुड़ियों का खेल नहीं है. The moment we use our mother tongue, things become so connected and we can identify with them more. So I think it's a great job. And I also, as a reader, I would really love to read these stories in Hindi. I try to look for them, and I don't know where I can find Hindi, a Hindi translation of the book. But
I think
yeah,
I think that it should be available. I think at the Radha Krishna Prakashan group, if I'm not mistaken. But I have to give a lot of the credit for some of the cultural nuances to Apurva, because the many resonances that the dolls had, and in some aspects of of place or even of humor, it was very necessary to have someone who had kind of lived through that type of atmosphere. There's a story, Big Man, which is a similar sort of humorous account of an encounter between officialdom and people who are just trying to get across a railway track in the countryside. This is one of the stories where he was definitely able to identify what it was that we needed to bring out. And similarly, the first title for the play of dolls I had come up with was the play of puppets, but dolls was actually the right word. So it's very useful to work with others in this process. It's not a isolated adventure at all.
Okay, another question asked by students, it's like just a technical question. How do you deal with idioms, sayings in particular language? For example, all that glitters is not gold, the grass is always greener. And in Hindi, the student has written Raat gayi, baat gayi.
I think idiom is something that will, plagues many different translators, or maybe not plagues, but gives them a creative opportunity. One of the tricks which we were taught is to look at what the kind of logic is, in the idiom, what is being said, and to try to break down the relationship in the idiom and that logic. And once you kind of understand that basic meaning, it gives you a little bit of flexibility to reconstruct it. One of the ways translators deal with this is they will take one idiom which is very unique to the local culture, and in that sense is evocative, and then they will completely find some equivalent in their own culture, and just kind of drop that in. But that can feel a little bit rough, if I think there's an idiom, if I'm not mistaken, I think in Eskimo culture that has to do with snow, because snow is part of their day-to-day existence, and there are maybe different, like 99 or something different ways of discussing snow. And yet I think one of the ways in which one of their idioms was translated in some context had to do with a bird in another culture, and so how does snow become a bird? So it's possible to look at the logic and to kind of think through how do you hold on to some of the local nuances, but I wouldn't say there's any one way ticket to getting to the right answer.
Okay. Anushka, I'm unmuting you. You can ask your question. Go ahead. Anushka, you can ask your question. You're unmuted.
Can I also ask Apurva, do you want to come in on any of these questions?
Sure, I just couldn't see Apurva.
Yeah, I kind of hid myself off. Here I am. Well, I don't have much to add. I mean, John has done such a wonderful job of explaining the whole thing and going through these stories. So I really haven't prepared to kind of talk today. And I think John has covered most of the ground very well. You asked for the original book, Preeti, about of the original Hindi book for this. I'm going to send you a link of that. It's there on Amazon, and it's called Akaron Ke Aaspaas. And I was this analogy of when you were talking about how can you express everything that's cultural and that's beyond language into language. Even the act of writing is in a way not translating, but writing is in a way an act of translation, in the sense that you are translating things that are not on paper into something that's language. So the dynamics of how it works in translation works pretty much in the same way, I feel. That you obviously lose a lot of what's not in language when you put it in language. And likewise, when you lose a lot of stuff when you put it from one language into another. But at the same time, you might just gain something additional by putting it into another language. Just one thought that came into my mind in the conversation.
Apur, sir, one thing, when I was reading the Play of the Dolls story, and the character of the woman who makes the puppets, the dolls, it evolves. It kind of becomes a very surreal experience of the conversation and the bhasha of the girl and the boy talking. Like I remember, and it was so beautiful to read, and I was like, I wish I was reading this in Hindi, because English is also, when it's translated, it is gripping. I'll just read 2 lines. Maybe it will resonate. Today she looked particularly happy. As soon as we met, she chirped. I went and got married this morning. And, like things like that are so Indian, in like culturally Indian. Why are you so surprised? Who did you marry? Well, there is this idiot. But why? I'm going to be a mother. My child needs a father. But who was he? So, like this conversation of like this jugalbandi of the dialogues that we read, it makes it so interesting. And in my head, I'm doing the translation and I'm having such a good time in the head. And I think that's what makes it enjoyable. So I would like you to share how when you translated it, what were your inputs? That would be wonderful.
Well, as I said, John has covered the ground pretty well. But you're right. I mean, we went back and forth on a number of these things. I remember you mentioned culvert. Even on culvert, the Hindi word is puliya there. So puliya. Exactly. So that's we luckily have some sort of an equivalent in culvert. But likewise, there's this episode that you spoke of, and it's got a sort of multiple dimensions to it. The girl is a very strong character in the story. This girl is a really strong character in the story. She's not on the back burner. She's stronger than that male character, in my opinion. And she's also playing with the man, and she's kind of moving the narrative forward. And there's a sort of underbelly of humor involved over there. So to balance all these aspects in the translation was definitely challenging, and a very small minor inflection here and there, or this word instead of that word, can change the whole sort of flavor of the piece. And one thing that I've noticed in my father's works, especially in his poetry, is that he uses very, very precise words. The placing of words and the kind of usage of words is very precise, and you have to attend to that in a translation as well. You have a Muktibodh in your syllabus, and very early on, I've mentioned this in my introduction as well, in the afterword as well. Muktibodh was one of the first people to spot this aspect in Kuan Narayan. Way back in 1961, he wrote the preface to his second collection of poetry called Parivesh Hamtun, and he mentioned this placing of the balancing of the objective with the subjective, and the balancing of colors and lines with thoughts and so on. So that is a very kind of delicate, precise balancing act in Kuan Narayan, and a translator has to be attentive to that as well. So that's you're right. I mean, the passage that you read is an example of how the cultural aspect has to be translated, how the humor has to be translated, how the progression of the story has to be translated, and all of these elements have to be balanced for that. Yeah. Let me send you the link.
Thank you so much. I think so. Sure.
I'm going to send you the link of that original.
Mali, you want to ask a question?
Preeti, I think Anushka has been wanting to ask something since very long. Can you just allow her to ask?
I unmuted her, but I think there was no voice. Anushka, you have been unmuted.
Am I audible now?
Yeah.
Yes, perfect.
Yes. Okay. So my question is that when it comes to translating poetry, it can be challenging to like evoke the same feelings and responses as the original poetry can evoke. And then there comes the challenge of the fact that most of the languages, like no two languages have all the words. Like if there exists a word in one language, it's not necessary that there will be the same word in the other language as well. So how do you deal with that?
Is that for John or for me?
Yeah, any of you can answer.
Before, I'll let you take this one since you have translated more poetry than I have objectively. So I will leave it to you.
Well, I think it's the same sort of story in poetry and prose. The particular collection of stories that we're talking about is a very poetic collection. The stories are extremely poetic and very nuanced in terms of their word usage. So a lot of the things that would apply to poetry do apply to this book also, I feel. And you're right. I mean, this is a translator's struggle. You have to constantly kind of look for the right words, and those words may not have straight equivalents in the target language. So then you look for alternatives, and you lose something, you compromise something, you gain something. That's the nature of the beast. So I guess I don't have any answers to how one should do that. It's a kind of a situational case-to-case thing, and you have to tackle it every time you encounter it in a different context and in a different sort of milieu. John, would you like to add anything to this?
Well, I do think that to some ways poetry poses challenges that prose doesn't, and Apurva talked about some of the hyper precision of words for translating these stories. I think most of the time when you're translating prose, some of the pressure, the creative pressure to make sure that every word is right is maybe not quite so intense, but I would imagine that in poetry, quite often that pressure is there. I think, outside of just word choice, one thing which has always interested me about poetry translation has more to do with genre to genre, or a wider structural level, where I've often seen, at least in the US, that there's a type of like very, clipped, short, modernist, type of poetry, which I think is considered, beautiful, maybe in the Pound, Ezra Pound tradition, because of its briefness. And yet I've seen that there are many other types of poetry in other cultures that don't really operate in that way. And so even though it reads quite nicely in English, I see that, some of what the poem was doing in the original in terms of its melody, in terms of, some of the evocativeness, sometimes can't do the language jump. And that's just, one aspect of this problem that has always particularly fascinated me. Why is that? What is wrong with English that it can't, do these other things as well?
Actually, I'll add two more things on this. I think I was giving the answer strictly in terms of word choice. The way word choice operates in poetry, I feel operates pretty much the same way in prose. But poetry has several other dimensions that you have to attend to, which you may not have to in prose. I mean, it's obvious that there's rhythm, there's rhyme, there's alliteration, there's syntax of various sorts. All of those dimensions get aggravated and exaggerated in a poetry translation. And in Kuan Narayan's poetry in particular, as I said, apart from the precision of words, it's also a very pure and very honest kind of poetry. Right now, this latest Nobel laureate, Louise Gluck from America, who's won it, there's a huge debate going on whether her poetry is very straightforward, very honest, is very kind of craftless and confessional sort of poetry, or whether it's a very imagistic and very so that there's a debate raging in terms of what poetry should be actually. And I find it a very good choice actually for this year's Nobel, because some of the qualities that I see in her poetry are also the qualities that I see in Kuan Narayan's poetry, which is this honesty and which is this purity and which is this sort of when you mature in your writing to a certain level, then you stop being impressed by images and by rhetoric of a particular kind, and of very fancy metaphors and of very innovative images. Those become sort of secondary to the main body of your work and to the content and to the literature. So that's the process of maturation, I would say. This is actually, I'm borrowing a line from Borges. This another writer apart from Kafka who my father has been very, very impressed with. And some of his stuff echoes in these stories also. And this is what Borges says, that the more you mature as a poet or as a writer, the less you get fascinated with superficial experimentation or fancy metaphors or linguistic prowess and so on. And you tend to kind of mature into a writer who's more concerned with what he or she is saying. And this is what this current year's Nobel laureate Louise Gluck seems to be doing in her poetry. And this is a lot of poetry of Konal Narayan is like that. On the surface, it seems very simple, very simply constructed. The language isn't complicated, but when you actually translate it, you begin to realize where the layers are, and the cultural layers, the content layers, the layers of hidden meanings in them, the larger meanings which are beyond that poem, in fact, and it's something that I've talked about in my afterword. So these are things that you encounter as a translator, because ultimately, as John said in the beginning, closed reading is the first step to translating, and so these things.
Can I just add a little bit if Apurva has finished?
Yeah, I have.
A very, very simple example, Anushka, for your purpose as a student, which I would like to give you. Next semester we do a couple of poems by Mamang Dai, our living poetess from Arunachal, and she writes such beautiful poems. I would love to translate those poems into Hindi at some point of time. So there is this very beautiful poem called "The Voice of the Mountain," which we have and which our students will be reading the next semester. The Voice of the Mountain, if you just look at the title, and I as a translator go on to translate it, what would it be? Will it be Pahad ki Awaaz, or will it be Pahad ne kaha? Are you getting me? And when you go on to read the poem closely, as you just said, you will actually probably like to stay on with Pahad ne mujhse kaha, So these are the various stages that you encounter while translating, and this is an effort which is a reward in itself, because why is there a hurry to reach the destination? Why is there a hurry to be appreciated? You should wait to be criticized, and that's, I think, very, very rewarding. That's it.
Very true.
Is there any more question? Let's open the platform for questions. I think one of the questions that I think there are a lot of questions, but I think in the series of questions that we have taken till now, more or less every question has been answered. The last sort of remarks I would love to have from John, obviously, and Apurva sir, from you. What will be your message for students who are thinking of maybe going for a master's degree in translation, close reading? What would be your message to those students?
This is a very nice and difficult question. So forgive me if I borrow a few seconds just to kind of to think of what I should say. Apurva can jump in before me if he's ready.
I personally haven't gone through a course of translation or literature, whatever. It's just been purely organic, my interest in this whole thing. So I think John would give a better answer, but I don't know.
I think, so I'm not sure if this is would be necessarily applied, just to a master's in English or in close reading. But I think that a lot of what is happening today is really complicating the traditional study of the humanities and the traditional study of literature. We have all of this data now. So we talk about close reading, But now, we could also talk about, I forget the exact term, a type of broad reading and trends. So what is the importance of close and intimate reading, in an environment when we're saturated with information from every direction? Another one, there's a translation scholar, Emily Apter, who has kind of made an attempt to link translation studies with other kind of adjacent fields in social science, public policy, or other areas. I think what is kind of interesting about this approach is I sense an attempt to kind of wed the study of the humanities with some of the broader issues, that are very rapidly unfolding in our world. But at the same time, I'm kind of suspicious, of this attempt because, oftentimes if you try to instrumentalize, the humanities and what it does, a lot of the joy and the exploration and the mystery in the first place gets lost. So this, for me, has kind of created a certain kind of dilemma. And I think that, the answer to solving the dilemma is actually, within the tradition of the humanities itself. But I do sense a churning taking place. And I think that, there are a lot of really great questions and problems that one can explore right now, and translation and what is untranslatable, or what is, what can be translated, like Kumarji's type of humanism. I think all of these are very important avenues for today. So I guess that would be some sort of message I could convey.
Any small inputs for students from Apurva?
No, follow your heart. Basically, this is an area where you should follow your heart, and I would always strongly urge students to only translate what they like and what they really love as a piece of literature or as a piece of work. I'm not sure literary translation can be very successful if you force yourself to translate something, or if you take on something as a commission project or whatever. Of course, people do that, and that also works. But yeah, follow your heart, I think, is a very important principle for anyone in literary translation.
I would also like to add, for our students who are, who start from undergraduate studies and they're studying English as a, their experience has been with English is of second language, although nowadays with social media posts and Twitterati and Instagrammers, people are using less and less Hindi. But, I was reading your father's one poetry, which I thought I loved reading that. And I thought maybe we could end on that note, in which he says something about kamzori. And a lot of students tell me that, they feel so skeptical of writing in English because authors use big words and big jargon, and it's kind of scares them to write in the second language. So they're more comfortable in the Hindi language. So, and I read it, and I would like to just say this line written by your father. He says, "Guzarte lamhon mein sadiyan talash karta hoon. ये मेरी प्यास है नदियां तलाश करता हूँ. यहाँ तो लोग गिनाते हैं खूबियां अपनी, मैं अपने में कमियां तलाश करता हूँ." So I think our students should not worry about the mistakes they're going to mistakes. And as John condensed his talk, and he also said that you should never be skeptical of wrong writing, mistakes, and insecurity. You can always learn. And with this, I think I'll invite Dr. Geeta. Dr. Geeta, are you there?
Hi,
Dr.
Preeti.
Geeta?
Yeah, I'm here.
So,
thank you.
I'll ask a request Dr. Geeta to express a vote of thanks for the event. Dr. Geeta, over to you.
All right, thank you. That was actually a very fascinating session, I must say, Mr. John Barter, and particularly for sharing his experience as a translator, and highlighting the nuances one needs to attend to in the act of translation, be it the choices of words or reproducing the technique of the original writer, or be it the context that underpin the text, the original text. So I take this opportunity to thank you, Mr. Potter, for being with us today and engaging with us, with your insightful lecture. And I also thank Mr. Apurva Narayan, who's, engaged with us and who's taken this questions by students, and also for, sharing with us a glimpse of the poetic imagination of Kunwan Narayan. I actually had wanted to read the collection of short story I had purchased as well, but I just didn't have the time to read. But I'm surely going to do that. And let me take this opportunity to thank our principal, Dr. Shiv Kumar Sahdev, for joining us today and for extending his support to our event. Well, this is our second webinar in this session, and I must say that our students have done a tremendous job, and everyone has given their best in putting this program together. And I particularly take note of the students who are part of the project, the creative project team and the tech team. You've done a fine job, guys. And on behalf of the department, I extend my heartfelt appreciation to the core members of the organizing committee who have successfully coordinated with the students, the faculty, the tech support at the college, and bringing us together to listen to Mr. Water and Mr. Narayan. Most importantly, I thank our teacher in charge, Ms. Preeti Desodia, for taking the lead in organizing this event and showing us the promise of more such programs in the future. Thank you. Preeti, you may please take over.
Thank you so much, Geeta. Thank you, everybody who joined us today. And John, Apurva, I think we would really love to do another set of events on close reading and translation, if that is possible in the near future, because due to COVID, our first semester students will not be able to listen to this interaction. Maybe they will on YouTube, but I think it has been an honor and a beautiful experience for all of us here to have you as speakers. And also, just for the record, we also had a short story competition, and our students have tried their hand on short story. And I would also like, again, take the opportunity to announce the 3 winners of a short story. And if they are here, they can just tell us the name of the story, and certificates will be given to you after this event. So for the short story competition, the first winner is from semester 3rd, Ayushi Sekka. The second prize goes to Dipanshu. And the third prize goes to Miss Ramanjeet Kaur. And I congratulate you all on being the winners. And I hope this creative effort and endeavor keeps on going up and up and up, and you go to better universities and have great excellence in academics or whichever field you want to enter in. Thank you so much for joining us. Congratulations once again. Thank you, John. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thanks.
Hope to see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you.